The matter of gun control has been a divisive topic of debate in American politics. In recent years, we've witnessed some of the worst gun violence in American history. Just this last year, nearly 20,000 Americans lost their lives to firearms, signaling the development of a worrisome trend that simply can't be ignored. Advocates for greater gun control argue that for the safety of Americans, our government must institute more extensive legislation to restrict and in some cases outright ban the ownership of certain firearms. On the other hand, advocates for less gun control argue that these laws violate their constitutional rights and thus the federal government has no legal authority on the matter. Regardless of one's current views, gaining a better understanding of the opposing side can still be tremendously beneficial. Through a diverse set of perspectives, we can often gain awareness of new ideas that may have initially been overlooked. This whole debate stems from the Second Amendment and its frustratingly ambiguous wording. In particular, the passage that states, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Before I dive deeper into analysis, let's take a moment to examine the historical context that may have influenced the wording and inclusion of this passage. Prior to the American Revolution, towns all across the colonies were expected to raise militias composed of ordinary citizens who sought to defend their communities. However, shortly after the war began, Americans realized that loosely organized militias were simply insufficient against a well-trained army such as that of the British Empire. As a result, the Continental Army was established. While militias did still remain in use for the years to come, they played an increasingly less important role compared to that of the National Army. After gaining independence, the question of whether or not to limit the power of the federal government was raised. On one hand, Federalists saw a strong, centralized government as critical for our nation to survive, and thus the creation of a constitution was seen as absolutely necessary for this to work. However, the opposing anti-federalists wished to keep the weak Articles of Confederation that made the U.S. more of a loose alliance of sovereign states rather than a unified nation. As a result of these disagreements, a compromise was reached in which the Constitution would be ratified, but with the inclusion of a Bill of Rights detailing the powers granted to the government and to the people. By having this legal framework, the Constitution would be able to safeguard Americans against excessive government overreach. And while the Second Amendment may have limited the federal government's ability to regulate firearms, states were left with the ability to do as they saw fit. This unique arrangement has resulted in firearm regulation varying greatly across different states. Much of the current debate is over the specific interpretation of the language utilized in this section of the Constitution. Some believe that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms only against a military threat, while others see it simply as a protected individual right. Both interpretations are perfectly valid given the undeniably vague language utilized. However, historical and recent court rulings have shown the Supreme Court's position on the matter, which is, the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to bear arms not solely within a militia. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Researchers have used computational linguistics to argue that based on similar historical documents of the time, the phrase bear arms had a militia-backed meaning in approximately 90% of their results, strongly implying that the Second Amendment was referring to military and not individual use. While constitutionality is a major part of the issue, the relevance of the Second Amendment in modern America is also a contributing factor behind this debate. Those pushing for greater gun restrictions argue that America is a fundamentally different nation that has different values than before, and hence the utility of guaranteeing the right to bear arms, given the potential dangers that come with it, must be reassessed. Whereas those arguing for fewer restrictions see the possession of a firearm simply as a means of self-defense or self-reliance. What's often overlooked is the fact that a complete ban of a certain firearm doesn't necessarily stop the distribution of the given firearm. Rather, it limits the federal government's ability to track these sales while still allowing criminals to purchase these guns through dark web markets from anonymous vendors all around the world. Given my research, I strongly believe that any rash action would be ill-advised. Evidently, there's a lot more nuance to this issue than either side would like to admit. Constitutionality-wise, I tend to side with the Supreme Court, as it is difficult to find fault in the arguments of those who have dedicated their lives to studying constitutional law. However, I do also find merit in the argument that America has changed greatly over the last few centuries, and the firearms available today are much different than those in the past. The reality of modern politics is that there's no right or wrong side. Because of our vast geographic and societal variation, what applies to you doesn't necessarily apply to everyone else. It can be easy to question the necessity of firearms if you live in a city where law enforcement is readily available, but someone living in a more rural setting might not have that same luxury and would be required to take matters of self-defense into their own hands. It is my belief that this simple lack of understanding is fueling not just the issue of gun control, but much of the increased polarization of American politics, and until we collectively work to settle these differences, things will only get worse.